It is July 1518 in the city of Strasbourg. The city is prosperous, by the standards of the era, a trading hub on the Rhine, well connected to the commerce of the Holy Roman Empire, home to several thousand people living the ordinary, difficult, religiously saturated life of a northern European city in the early 16th century. A woman steps into the street. Her name is Frau Troffea. We do not know her first name. We know almost nothing about her, her age, her occupation, her family, her history. She is one of the thousands of ordinary people who moved through Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, leaving almost no trace in the historical record. Except for this. She begins to dance. There is no music. There is no celebration. There is no apparent reason. She simply begins to move arms, legs, body in the rhythmic, compulsive motion that observers recognize as dancing, though the dancing looks nothing like joy. Her face, witnesses will later report, is not the face of someone enjoying herself. It is the face of someone who cannot stop. She dances for the rest of the day. She dances through the night. She is still dancing the following morning. By the end of the first week, 34 people have joined her in the street. They did not plan to. They did not choose to. They simply began, one by one, drawn into the same compulsive, agonized movement, and found, like Frau Troffea, that they could not stop. By the end of the month, there are 400 people dancing in the streets of Strasbourg. Their feet are bleeding. Their legs are failing. Some of them are dying of exhaustion, of heart failure, of stroke, still dancing, still moving, unable to stop even as their bodies break down beneath them. The city authorities are desperate. They consult physicians. They consult priests. They build a stage. They hire musicians. They try everything they can think of. Nothing works. And 600 years later, we are still not entirely sure what happened in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518. We have theories, good ones, serious ones, backed by medical and historical research. But we do not have a complete explanation for how 400 people came to dance themselves to death in the streets of a medieval city. This is the full story of the dancing plague of 1518. To understand the dancing plague, you have to understand the world it emerged from. Because the dancing plague of 1518 was not an event that fell from a clear sky. It grew from a specific soil, a specific combination of social, economic, religious, and psychological conditions that made the summer of 1518 in Strasbourg a uniquely fertile ground for catastrophe. Strasbourg in 1518 was a city under pressure. The city had been through years of severe hardship. The early 16th century brought a series of disasters to the Rhine Valley and the surrounding region: crop failures, famine, outbreaks of disease, the ongoing instability of a political landscape that was about to be shattered by the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther was, at this very moment, preparing the theological arguments that would split European Christianity within the decade. The world that Strasbourg's inhabitants knew was about to change in ways they could not yet foresee, but could perhaps already feel. More immediately, the people of Strasbourg in 1518 were hungry and sick and frightened. The harvests in the preceding years had been poor. Food prices were high. The threat of famine was real and present. Syphilis, a relatively new disease in Europe at that time, having arrived sometime in the 1490s and spread rapidly, was producing suffering across the continent. Smallpox and plague moved through populations with the lethal indifference of diseases in an era before vaccination or effective treatment. And the people of Strasbourg, like virtually all people in 16th century Europe, lived within a framework of religious belief that was simultaneously their primary source of comfort and their primary source of terror. The medieval and early modern Catholic worldview was saturated with the possibility of divine punishment, the sense that suffering was not random but meaningful, that disease and famine and catastrophe were the expressions of God's anger, that the appropriate response to calamity was not analysis but penance. This is not a description of superstition, in the dismissive sense. It is a description of a coherent worldview, one in which the physical and the spiritual were not separate domains, in which the body could be affected by forces that were not biological in the modern sense, in which the line between what happened to the body and what happened to the soul was not clearly drawn. Into this world, exhausted, hungry, frightened, spiritually saturated, Frau Troffea stepped into a street in July 1518 and began to dance. The historical record of the dancing plague of 1518 is, by the standards of 16th century documentation, remarkably good. There are contemporary accounts from physicians, city records, sermons, and chronicles that allow historians to reconstruct the basic facts of the outbreak with reasonable confidence. The historian John Waller, who has written the most comprehensive modern scholarly account of the event in his 2008 book A Time to Dance, A Time to Die, has drawn on these sources to produce a picture that is specific, detailed, and deeply strange. Frau Troffea danced, by the accounts, for between 4 and 6 days before she was removed from the street and taken to a shrine at Saverne, in the hope that religious intervention might bring relief. The shrine was dedicated to Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr whose name was, in the popular belief of the era, associated with involuntary movement and dancing. People suffering from what we would now call chorea, a neurological condition causing involuntary, dance-like movements, were said to be afflicted with Saint Vitus dance, and the saint was believed to have both the power to curse people with dancing and the power to cure them of it. Whether the shrine helped Frau Troffea we do not know. What we know is that by the time she was removed, others had begun to dance, and the shrine of Saint Vitus was not large enough for what was coming. The progression of the dancing plague of 1518 followed a pattern that epidemiologists studying mass psychogenic illness would recognize immediately, though the term and the concept did not exist in 1518. It started with one person, it spread to a few, the few became dozens, the dozens became hundreds. The speed of the spread was remarkable. Within days of Frau Troffea's initial dancing, others were joining her in the street. Contemporary accounts describe the process as something that happened to people. They did not decide to dance. They began dancing. The compulsive quality of the movement was consistent across all those affected. They danced against their will, they were clearly distressed, and they could not stop. The city authorities of Strasbourg, the magistrates and the guild masters who governed the city's affairs, were confronted with a situation for which their experience and their frameworks provided no guidance. Nothing in their administrative history had prepared them for 400 people dancing involuntarily in the streets. They consulted physicians. The physicians of 1518 operated within the framework of Galenic medicine, the system inherited from the ancient Greek physician Galen, which understood disease in terms of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was the balance of these humors. Disease was their imbalance. Treatment was aimed at restoring the balance through bleeding, purging, dietary adjustment, and the management of environmental factors. The physicians who examined the dancers concluded that the cause was an excess of hot blood, a humoral imbalance that produced the compulsive, uncontrollable movement. This was not a diagnosis arrived at carelessly. It reflected the genuine engagement of the best medical thinking available in 1518 with a genuinely puzzling clinical presentation. Their treatment recommendation was, by the standards of humoral medicine, internally coherent. The hot blood needed to be worked through. The dancing was an expression of the imbalance, and the imbalance would resolve itself if the dancing was allowed to continue and to run its course. The city authorities accepted this advice. They cleared the guild hall. They built a stage in the public square. They hired musicians, drummers, and pipers to provide music for the dancers. They brought in professional dancers to keep the afflicted company and, presumably, to model the eventual exhaustion and cessation of movement that the physicians predicted. This decision, made in good faith, by people doing their best with the knowledge and frameworks available to them, almost certainly made things dramatically worse. Because one of the things we now understand about mass psychogenic illness is that it is highly sensitive to the social environment in which it occurs. Validation, the explicit or implicit message from authority figures that the illness is real, that it is serious, and that the appropriate response is to continue in the behavior, tends to perpetuate and spread the condition. By building a stage, hiring musicians, and treating the dancing as a legitimate medical phenomenon requiring accommodation rather than interruption, the city authorities of Strasbourg were providing exactly the kind of social validation that mass psychogenic illness thrives on. More people began to dance. The accounts from this period describe scenes that are genuinely difficult to imagine. Hundreds of people in the streets and the guild hall, moving compulsively, many of them weeping or screaming, their feet raw and bleeding, their bodies failing from exhaustion and dehydration, and yet unable to stop. The music played continuously. The stage remained occupied. The dancers danced. Physicians and city records from the period indicate that during the peak of the outbreak, approximately 15 people per day were dying. 15 deaths per day, from exhaustion, cardiac failure, and stroke, among people who were dancing against their will and could not stop. The total death toll from the dancing plague of 1518 is estimated at somewhere between dozens and several hundred people. The records are incomplete, and the counting of deaths attributable specifically to the dancing versus deaths from the background rate of disease and hardship in 16th century Strasbourg is not straightforward. But the deaths were real. They were documented. They were the direct consequence of the dancing. The outbreak continued for approximately 2 months, from mid-July to early September 1518. It ended, apparently, as suddenly as it had begun, the dancing ceasing without any clear triggering event, the remaining dancers recovering, the city returning to its normal, difficult 16th century life. What had happened? The dancing plague of 1518 has attracted serious scholarly and scientific attention, and the theories that have been proposed to explain it range from the well-supported to the genuinely exotic. Let us go through them carefully. Theory 1. Mass psychogenic illness. This is the explanation that most modern historians and medical researchers find most convincing, and it is the one that John Waller argues for most compellingly in his scholarly account. Mass psychogenic illness, also called mass hysteria, though the latter term is now considered somewhat outdated and imprecise, is a real, documented, medically recognized phenomenon in which symptoms spread through a group of people in the absence of any physical cause that could account for the pattern of spread. It is not fakery. It is not deliberate performance. The symptoms are genuine. The people experiencing them are really suffering, really unable to control their behavior, really physically affected. But the cause is psychological and social rather than biological. The conditions that produce mass psychogenic illness are well understood from modern cases. They tend to occur in populations that are under significant stress, economic, social, or existential. They tend to occur in contexts where the symptom has cultural meaning, where the community has a framework that makes the specific symptom comprehensible and significant. They tend to spread through social networks, through people who know each other, who share the same environment, who are exposed to the same stressors and the same cultural frameworks. Strasbourg in 1518 checks every box. The population was under extreme stress from famine, disease, and social instability. The religious framework of the era provided a specific cultural script for the symptom. Saint Vitus, dance, was a known concept, a recognized category of affliction with specific religious significance and a specific set of responses. And the community was tightly interconnected in the way that a medieval city of several thousand people necessarily is. Waller argues that the dancing plague began with Frau Troffea, who was herself under particular personal stress. The account suggests she may have been in conflict with her husband, and who, in the grip of extreme psychological distress, began to exhibit the symptom that her cultural framework made available to her. Not consciously, not deliberately, but in the way that the body, under sufficient stress, can produce physical symptoms that are not consciously chosen. And once the symptom was visible, once it was in the street, observable, recognized within the cultural framework of St. Vitus dance, it became available to others. Each new person who began to dance validated the reality of the phenomenon for those who had not yet been affected, making it more likely that the next susceptible person would also begin to dance. The city authorities' decision to build a stage and hire musicians, whatever its internal logic, provided the final ingredient: official validation. The authorities were, in effect, confirming that the dancing was real, serious, and expected to continue. For a population primed by stress and cultural expectation, this was the message that allowed the outbreak to reach its catastrophic scale. Theory 2. Ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus, Claviceps purpurea, that grows on rye and other grain crops, particularly in wet conditions. It produces a range of toxic compounds, including ergotamine, which constricts blood vessels, and compounds that are chemically related to the psychedelic substance LSD. Ergot poisoning, ergotism, was a significant and recurring problem in medieval and early modern Europe, where rye bread was a dietary staple. Its symptoms include convulsions, hallucinations, sensations of burning in the extremities, and in some forms, involuntary movement. The ergot hypothesis for the dancing plague has a certain appeal. It provides a purely physical explanation for involuntary movement in a population that was certainly consuming grain, possibly contaminated grain. It was proposed in the 1970s by the historian Linda Caporal, originally as an explanation for the Salem witch trials, and has been applied to various episodes of mass unusual behavior in European history. However, most historians who have examined the 1518 case closely find the ergot hypothesis insufficient as a complete explanation. The primary problem is the pattern of spread. Ergot poisoning affects people who eat contaminated grain. It should, if it were the cause, affect people indiscriminately across a population, or at least across all those eating from the same contaminated supply. But the dancing plague spread through the population in the specific, network-following pattern of a socially transmitted condition. It moved through people who had been in contact with existing dancers, not through people who had eaten from the same bread supply. Additionally, ergot poisoning does not produce the specific symptom of dancing. It produces convulsions, which are different in character from the coordinated, dance-like movements described in the 1518 accounts. And the survivors of the outbreak did not report the burning extremities, the gangrene, and the other physical symptoms of ergotism that contemporary accounts of known ergot outbreaks describe. Ergot poisoning may have been a background factor. may have contributed to the general state of physical and psychological stress in the population, but it is not sufficient as a complete explanation. Theory 3. Religious ecstasy. Some scholars have proposed that the dancing plague was not an involuntary affliction at all, but a form of deliberate religious practice, a tradition of ecstatic dancing associated with certain saints' cults, which was stigmatized and suppressed by the Church, and therefore appears in the historical record as pathological rather than devotional. This theory has some supporting evidence. There are documented traditions of ecstatic dance in medieval European religious practice, and the association of the dancers with the shrine of Saint Vitus suggests a religious dimension to the event. But it does not account for the reported anguish and distress of the dancers, the deaths, or the explicitly involuntary character of the dancing as described by contemporary witnesses. People who are dancing for religious reasons generally know why they are dancing. Theory 4. Something we have not identified. This is not a theory so much as an honest acknowledgement that our knowledge has limits. The historical record of the 1518 outbreak, while relatively good for its era, is still fragmentary and filtered through the interpretive frameworks of 16th-century observers. We are reading events through the eyes of people who understood the world very differently from us, using concepts and categories that do not map cleanly onto modern medical or psychological understanding. It is possible that the full explanation for the dancing plague of 1518 involves factors, social, biological, environmental, psychological, that we have not yet fully identified or understood. The mass psychogenic illness explanation is the most compelling currently available, but it is not a complete explanation. It describes the mechanism of spread without fully explaining why this specific symptom, in this specific population, at this specific time. The honest answer is, we do not fully know. The dancing plague of 1518 was not an isolated event. It was the last and best documented outbreak of a phenomenon that had been recurring across Europe for several centuries, a phenomenon known collectively as dancing mania. The earliest well-documented outbreak occurred in 1374 in the Rhineland region of what is now Germany and the Low Countries. In the aftermath of the Black Death, the bubonic plague that had killed between a third and a half of Europe's population in the preceding decades, large groups of people in multiple cities began to dance compulsively in the streets. The accounts describe scenes remarkably similar to those of 1518. Involuntary, anguished, uncontrollable dancing that continued until the dancers collapsed. The 1374 outbreak was associated with a specific religious figure, John the Baptist rather than Saint Vitus, and was interpreted by contemporary observers in specifically religious terms. The dancers were seen as either divinely afflicted or demonically possessed, depending on the theological framework of the observer. Smaller outbreaks occurred throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. In 1237, in the German city of Erfurt, a group of children reportedly danced compulsively through the streets until they reached the town of Arnstadt, where many of them collapsed. In 1278, 200 people dancing on a bridge over the Moselle River caused the bridge to collapse. The historical record of these earlier outbreaks is less reliable than the 1518 documentation. We are further from the events, the sources are fewer, and the accounts are more heavily filtered through religious and moralizing interpretation. But the pattern across the centuries is consistent enough to suggest that the 1518 outbreak was not unique in kind, only in scale and in the quality of the surviving documentation. What do these repeated outbreaks tell us? They tell us, first, that whatever produced the dancing plague of 1518 was not a one-time alignment of unusual circumstances. It was a recurring phenomenon, tied to specific conditions, social stress, religious frameworks, specific cultural scripts for extreme distress that recurred across several centuries of European history. They tell us, second, that the phenomenon was geographically specific. Dancing mania was a European phenomenon, concentrated in the Rhineland and the Low Countries. It did not occur, as far as we know, in comparable form in other parts of the world at the same time. This geographical specificity is consistent with the mass psychogenic illness explanation. It was tied to specific cultural frameworks, specific religious traditions, specific social conditions that existed in that part of Europe and not elsewhere. And they tell us, third, that the phenomenon ended. After 1518, there are no further documented outbreaks of dancing mania in Europe. The specific conditions that had produced it, the specific combination of stress, religious framework, and cultural script changed. The Reformation reshaped European Christianity. The gradual development of early modern medicine provided new frameworks for understanding disease. The specific belief in Saint Vitus, dance, as a category of affliction, faded from the cultural vocabulary. Mass psychogenic illness did not end, as we will see, but the specific form it took in medieval and early modern Europe, the dancing mania, did. The dancing plague of 1518 raises questions that go far beyond the specific historical event. It opens a window into one of the most fascinating and least understood areas of human biology, the relationship between the mind and the body, and specifically the power of the mind, of belief, stress, expectation, and social influence, to produce real, measurable, sometimes catastrophic physical effects. This is not a medieval phenomenon. It is a contemporary one. Mass psychogenic illness, the spread of physical symptoms through a group in the absence of an identifiable physical cause, continues to occur today in documented, medically investigated cases in communities around the world. In 2011, in the town of Leroy, New York, a group of teenage girls at a local high school developed sudden, involuntary tics, twitching, jerking movements, verbal outbursts that spread through the school community over a period of weeks. The symptoms were real. The girls were genuinely suffering. Neurologists, environmental investigators, and public health officials investigated extensively and found no physical cause. The diagnosis was mass psychogenic illness. The outbreak eventually resolved. In 2012, in a school in Sri Lanka, more than 1,000 students developed symptoms, fainting, nausea, dizziness, in an outbreak that spread rapidly through the school population and required hospital treatment for hundreds of students. Again, no physical cause was found. Mass psychogenic illness. In 2019, in a school in Colombia, dozens of students developed seizure-like symptoms following a period of significant social stress in the community. The same diagnosis, the same pattern. These modern cases are studied with the tools of contemporary medicine, brain scans, blood tests, environmental sampling, psychological assessment, and they consistently fail to find a physical cause for the symptoms. The symptoms are produced by the mind, by stress, by suggestion, by the social contagion of symptom expression in a group that shares a common stressor and a common context. This is not to say the symptoms are not real. They are real. The neurological mechanisms that produce them are real if not fully understood. The suffering of the people who experience them is real. Mass psychogenic illness is not faking, not attention-seeking, not deliberate. It is the body expressing, through physical symptoms, a psychological distress that has no other available outlet. The concept that sits at the center of all of this is what medicine calls the mind-body connection, the now well-established but still imperfectly understood reality that psychological states produce physical effects. Stress raises blood pressure, suppresses the immune system, disrupts sleep, produces pain. Anxiety produces nausea, dizziness, chest tightness, shortness of breath. Depression produces physical fatigue, altered pain sensitivity, changed appetite. These effects are not imaginary. They are mediated by real physiological mechanisms, hormones, neurotransmitters, the autonomic nervous system, that are sensitive to psychological state in ways that modern medicine is still mapping. Mass psychogenic illness takes these mechanisms to an extreme. Under conditions of sufficient stress, in a context that provides a specific cultural script for symptom expression, the mind can produce symptoms of extraordinary severity, symptoms that spread through social networks, that affect dozens or hundreds of people simultaneously, and that can, as the dancing plague of 1518 demonstrates, be fatal. This is deeply unsettling to our intuitive sense of the self as autonomous and self-determining. We like to believe that our bodies are under our control, that we choose our movements, that our physical state is the product of what happens to us biologically rather than what we believe or what we expect, or what the people around us are doing. The dancing plague of 1518 challenges this belief directly. 400 people danced against their will. They were not choosing to dance. They were not performing. They were as genuinely unable to stop as Aaron Ralston was unable to move his pinned hand, as Poon Lim was unable to leave his raft. Their constraint was not physical but psychological, and that made it no less absolute. The self is less autonomous than we think. The body is more responsive to the mind and to the social environment that shapes the mind than our intuitions prepare us for. One of the most important and most often overlooked aspects of the dancing plague of 1518 is the role that religion played, not as an explanation for the dancing, but as the framework within which the dancing made sense to the people experiencing it. Saint Vitus was a Christian martyr of the early 4th century, whose cult had become associated, in the medieval popular imagination, with involuntary movement and dancing. The legend held that Saint Vitus had the power to inflict dancing madness on those who offended him, and also the power to cure those so afflicted. The appropriate response to Saint Vitus' dance, the term that was in common use in 16th century Europe for the condition, was a pilgrimage to a shrine of the saint, accompanied by prayer and penance. This framework is not simply a quaint superstition. It is a specific cultural technology for managing extreme distress, a set of beliefs, practices, and social expectations that provided the people of Strasbourg with a way of understanding what was happening to them, a set of actions they could take in response, and a community of shared experience within which the suffering could be held. When Frau Troffea began to dance, the people of Strasbourg did not experience it as a random, meaningless catastrophe. They experienced it within the framework of Saint Vitus' dance, a recognized category of affliction with known causes, the saint's anger or curse, known symptoms involuntary dancing, known treatments pilgrimage to the shrine, and known outcomes recovery through divine grace or death through divine judgment. This framework was both the cause of the outbreak and the container that gave it meaning. It was the cause because the cultural script of Saint Vitus' dance provided the specific symptom, dancing, that the psychological distress of the population expressed itself through. In a different cultural context, the same level of distress might have expressed itself through different symptoms. The specific symptom of dancing was culturally available, culturally meaningful, and culturally scripted. The people of Strasbourg knew what Saint Vitus' dance was before any of them began to dance. It was the container because it provided meaning. The dancers were not simply suffering randomly. They were, within their framework, caught in a divine or diabolical drama, afflicted by a saint, potentially redeemable through the correct ritual response, participants in a cosmic story that gave their suffering significance and their response direction. This is something that modern secular frameworks for understanding mass psychogenic illness sometimes miss. We explain the dancing plague in terms of stress and social contagion and psychological mechanisms, and these explanations are correct as far as they go. But they do not quite capture what it felt like from the inside. The experience of being a dancer in Strasbourg in 1518, embedded in a world of meaning that made the dancing not simply a symptom but a trial, a punishment, a test, a form of communication from the divine. The loss of that framework, the gradual secularization of European medicine and culture that followed the Reformation, changed the way that extreme distress expressed itself. The specific symptom of dancing mania disappeared because the cultural framework that made it available as a symptom disappeared. The distress itself did not disappear. Mass psychogenic illness did not disappear. It simply found new scripts, new symptoms, new cultural containers. In Leroy, New York in 2011, the symptom was tics rather than dancing. The framework was not saints' curses but environmental contamination. The teenagers and their families initially believed the symptoms were caused by toxic exposure, and this belief shaped how the symptoms spread and how the community responded. Different cultural script, same underlying mechanism. The dancing plague of 1518 is 600 years old. The city of Strasbourg is now a prosperous modern European city, the seat of the European Parliament, home to world-class universities, as far from the medieval trading hub of 1518 as it is possible to imagine while still occupying the same location. The specific conditions that produced the dancing plague, the famine, the particular religious framework, the cultural script of Saint Vitus dance, are gone. We will not see 400 people dancing themselves to death in a 21st century European city. But mass psychogenic illness is not gone. The underlying mechanisms, the sensitivity of the human mind and body to stress, to social contagion, to the power of expectation and belief, are as present today as they were in 1518. They are part of what it means to be a social animal with a powerful mind, a mind that can produce physical effects whose reality is not diminished by their psychological origin. Understanding this matters in several ways. It matters for how we respond to outbreaks of mass psychogenic illness when they occur in schools, in workplaces, in communities. The history of the dancing plague suggests that well-intentioned responses that validate and accommodate the symptoms, the 16th century equivalent of building a stage and hiring musicians, can make things worse. Modern understanding of mass psychogenic illness emphasizes the importance of calm, authoritative reassurance, the reduction of media attention and social amplification, and the treatment of the underlying stress that is driving the outbreak. It matters for how we think about the relationship between the mind and the body. The Cartesian model of the self as a mind in a body, the two largely separate, the mind controlling the body but not fundamentally constituted by it, is contradicted by everything that mass psychogenic illness tells us. The dancing plague is the most dramatic possible demonstration that the mind and the body are not separate. What the mind believes, what it expects, what the social environment communicates to it, these things produce real, measurable, sometimes fatal physical effects. And it matters for how we think about free will and individual autonomy. 400 people danced against their will. They could not stop. Their bodies were producing behavior that their minds did not direct and could not control. The assumption that we are the authors of our own physical behavior, that what our bodies do is what we choose to do, is challenged by the dancing plague at the most fundamental level. We are more social, more susceptible, more influenced by the beliefs and behaviors of those around us than the mythology of individual autonomy acknowledges. The dancing plague of 1518 makes this visible in an extreme and unforgettable way. The dancers were not weak. They were not stupid. They were not credulous in a way that makes them different from us. They were human beings under extreme stress, embedded in a cultural framework that shaped their response to that stress in ways they did not choose and could not control. That could happen to any of us, in different forms, with different symptoms, in different cultural containers. It has happened to people in our own time and will happen again. In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, 400 people danced. They danced in the street and in the guild hall, on the stage that the city built for them, and in the squares where their neighbors watched in horror and helplessness. They danced until their feet bled and their hearts gave out and their bodies simply stopped, and some of them kept dancing even then, or tried to, until there was nothing left to dance with. They did not want to dance. Every account we have of the experience describes it as anguished, terrifying, involuntary. They were prisoners of their own bodies, as surely trapped as Aaron Ralston pinned in Blue Jun Canyon, as surely constrained as Poon Lim on his 8-foot raft. Their constraint was invisible, produced not by a boulder or an ocean, but by something inside them that they could neither see nor fight. We call it mass psychogenic illness now. We have frameworks, medical, psychological, sociological, for understanding what happened. We know about stress and cultural scripts and the social contagion of symptoms. We know about the brainstem and the frontal lobe and the autonomic nervous system. We are, in this specific domain, smarter than the physicians of 1518 who prescribed more music for people who could not stop dancing. But we are not as far from the dancers of Strasbourg as we like to think. Mass psychogenic illness happens in our schools and our communities. Stress produces physical symptoms in our bodies. Social influence shapes our behavior in ways we do not fully perceive. The line between what we choose to do and what we are compelled to do by forces outside our conscious control is less clear, in the reality of human experience, than the mythology of individual autonomy suggests. Frau Troffea stepped into a street in July 1518 and began to dance. We do not know why she specifically was the first. We do not know what was happening in her life that summer, what particular pressure, what private anguish, what combination of circumstances brought her to that street and set her body in motion. We know only that she began, and that others followed, and that by the end of it, the city of Strasbourg had witnessed something that 6 centuries of scholarship has not fully explained. The dancing stopped in September 1518. The city went back to being a city. The Rhine kept flowing. The crops came in or they didn't. Life continued in the hard, ordinary 16th century way, with its diseases and its famine years and its approaching Reformation. And Frau Troffea, whatever became of her, stepped back out of history as quietly as she had stepped into it, leaving behind only the mystery of a summer when an entire city could not stop dancing. We are still trying to understand it. We may never fully get there, but we are, perhaps, a little closer to understanding ourselves for the trying. Thank you for watching. The Dancing Plague of 1518 is a story that I find genuinely haunting, not just as history but as a mirror. If this video made you think about the relationship between mind and body, between individual and community, between what we choose and what we cannot help, share it with someone. Subscribe for the next story. And leave a comment. What is the most disturbing part of the dancing plague to you? The involuntary nature of it. The city authorities building a stage. The fact that it could happen today. I want to know.